merciful Savior, keep Good evening. Welcome to the fifth in our spring series of Growing Through Loss. I am Susan Amos Palmer, the director of the program and the director of the North Suburban Grief Coalition. We welcome you tonight to Abiding Savior, our host church. We are very appreciative, Pastor Lisa, of your hospitality in hosting us. I have to qualify that because they do very nice hospitality, but it wasn't allowed this time because of COVID. So you have to just look at the table and pretend the food is there. I am going to open with a reading from this little book that I've been using called The Wind Blows, The Ice Breaks, Poems of Loss and Renewal by Minnesota Poets, edited by Ted Bowman and Elizabeth Bork Johnson. This one is by Bill Meisner, called The Dance of the Ripples. The Saturday evening after Dad's funeral, we find ourselves at the lake, and Mom wades alone into the calm, darkening waters. Deep in grief, her skin is a color of silt. Concentric circles move out from her thighs. Small ripples hurry away from her, travel the distance to the shore, and reach us, her children, who stand still, ankle deep, unable to talk, the humid blanket of dusk weighting down our shoulders. At this lake tonight, everything seems too quiet or too loud, rising or falling, moving or not moving. One of us exhales with a soft hiss. We watch her wade into deeper water up to her waist, though we all know she doesn't swim. But it is her heart we worry about now, her small red heart drowning inside the twilight of her body. I want to call out to her, not so deep, not so deep. He's not here to steady you when you step into the drop-off. Suddenly, music waves through the screen of the pavilion. Glenn Miller's saxophones roll smoothly toward us. Mother faces the center of the lake. Forgetting for a moment, she sways side to the rhythm, sending out small, sudden waves that glisten in the moonlight. It seems as though someone should ask her to dance. Then she closes her eyes, silencing the music while the ripples collapse their rings tightly around her waist, holding her, holding her. Our speaker tonight, John Hendricks, holds 2 undergraduate degrees, a BA in Biblical Studies and a BA in Theology and Missions from Bethany School of Missions, Providence College. His master's degree is in Biblical Counseling from Providence College and Seminary in St. Peter, Manitoba. He worked as a missionary for 4 years in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. He started working with Nystrom and Associates when they began in 1991 and has been working there since as a psychotherapist and director of training and development. He is licensed in marriage and family therapy. He presents a workshop for their clinicians twice a year on integrating psychology, theology, and spirituality. He has been involved in helping patients with grief issues for more than 25 years. He is married to Melanie for more than 35 years. They have 2 children, Ben and Renee, who are both married, and they have one grandchild, Jenny. Please welcome Jack Hendricks.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I spoke here a while back, and so as the years go on, we've this year will be our 30th year that we'll be in New Brighton as Nystrom Associates Mental Health Clinic, Rule 29. So we're celebrating 30 years this August, actually. And as time goes on, I think this is my 43rd year of marriage. And our kids at this point are 38 and 36. And so life goes faster and faster the older we get. It's hard to keep up sometimes. I started becoming interested in grief work as a psychotherapist. Here's the reason why primarily. There are multiple losses as we do therapy, not just the typical losses that we experience, death of a loved one, death of a parent, sometimes death of children. Suicidal death becomes much more complicated. And so part of my work on understanding suicide better was also to understand grief better. And I started that some years ago. Most therapists actually like doing grief work, primarily because it's extremely productive. If I can do it, it'll be my number one choice every time. Because if we can help a patient grieve, we're going to solve a lot of issues all at the same time. Not everyone is ready for that. Not everyone is willing to grieve appropriately and as much as we really need to. And so there are some times when people get stuck in their grief. And so that's why we're going to talk about complicated and accumulative grief. And first of all, what I want to do is, you have two handouts there, and at the very least, or two PowerPoints, I should say. The one is the one we'll go through tonight, and that's complicated and cumulative grief. But this other one, I hope that you pick up and take with you. It's self-care while experiencing grief. Take this one because it's some really good practical tips to help you as you grieve, and just a way of really taking care of yourself. Most of us are basically too hard on ourselves and not gracious enough and not kind enough. It's especially true when it comes to grieving losses. And so it's a more vulnerable time, and it's especially a time where you really need to take care of yourself. Take really good care of yourself as a balance of the pain that you're going to be experiencing and going through. And so I'm just going to read a little bit of the introduction under this self-care while experiencing grief, and then we'll begin to dive into the complicated grief. As an introduction, grief is a no judgment zone. There's no correct way to grieve. Everyone is unique, and so that because of that, your grieving is going to be unique to you. At the same time, we all have similar tasks that we will need to accomplish during our grieving, and we'll talk about that. We used to talk about stages of grief. Mostly you'll find, if you do the research, 5 stages of grieving. Some have come up with 7, even 10. Right now at this point, we really don't refer to stages of grief. And primarily because grief inevitably flows over into all of the neat and tidy boundaries that we want to put on it. And so this doesn't work that way. And so even the term stages is sort of like a misnomer. It's more accurate probably to talk about tasks that we try to accomplish while we grieve rather than stages of grief. So there's no correct way to grieve. Your grief is as unique as your fingerprint. It's important to honor your loss and give yourself the time and space to experience and feel your feelings. Your grief is a reflection of your love. And so if you want a really good resource, it's a very simple one called grief.com. And it's David Kessler, who has teamed up with the famous Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who actually who both of them originally came up with the stages of grief. That was quite some time ago. But in that website, he has some really, really good resources. And it is true, and it's helpful to note that when you're in the throes of grief and you're feeling a lot of pain, it's primarily because of the emotional attachment that you made and the sense of loss of that emotional attachment. That's love. And so the good news is that it shows and demonstrates that you're able to love. That's a really good thing. But inevitably, love can be painful when we lose the people in our lives that we've oftentimes spent years and years of caring for and loving. Freud, a long time ago, said that grief is a natural state that shouldn't be tampered with. David Kessler also says pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. We want to be able to be open and feel our emotional pain, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to suffer ongoing chronic kind of grieving. We cannot heal what we do not feel. That's another favorite saying of David Kessler. We cannot heal what we do not feel. And so you can't grieve in your head. You can't grieve by knowing all of the reasons and all of the whys and wherefores of your loss. It comes from feeling, and that's down deeper in your heart. Every tear you cry is a reflection of the love that you have for your loved one. Release anger and regret to make way for forgiveness as you build resilience and strength. Grief is a reflection of the connection that we've lost. Okay, so what is complicated grief? Let's start with the definition. So I don't know if it's easier for you to read the handout or if it's easier to read that, but let me try to help you define what complicated grief is. It's grief and loss which becomes debilitating and does not improve even after time passes. Painful emotions are so long-lasting and severe that it becomes very difficult to accept the loss and resume your life. Now, acceptance was known as the final stage of grief. And it becomes one of the goals or one of the tasks of grieving as well. Coming to a place of acceptance. It's difficult. And so part of the original feeling of the shock and disbelief that we go through, that might, and then one of the reasons why we don't think about it as stages is because we used to think that was the first stage of grief, right? You're in shock and disbelief, and then you finally come to grips, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth is that you go back and forth with shock and grief throughout your grieving and disbelief. And so it's not a one-time original initial stage of grieving. It'll actually come back several times as you grieve. When we lost my dad back in 1996, it was about 3 or 4 weeks after that my brother, one of my brothers, called my mother and asked to speak to my dad. He was in still a period of shock and disbelief. He just had a habit of calling and talking with him, and he had forgot that 3 weeks earlier he had died. People with complicated grief know that their loved one is gone, but they still cannot believe it. More on definition, it can seem like joy and satisfaction are gone forever. It can seem hard to imagine that life has purpose or meaning without their loved one. Other words for complicated grief are chronic, unresolved, protracted, delayed, and traumatic. This comes from the Center for Complicated Grief in Columbia University. Next slide. The Yale University psychologist Holly Prigerson found that about roughly 15% of people who have lost a loved one might be susceptible to complicated grief. Grief marked by broad changes to all relationships, a sense of meaninglessness, a prolonged yearning or searching for the deceased, and a sense of rupture in personal beliefs. People's feel like their world has been turned upside down. In a lot of ways it has, because part of our security and stability is centered in our relationships, and especially our closest relationships. And when things go wrong, and especially things that should never happen, like your kids going or passing away before you, that's when the world becomes really insecure, and it feels like what you thought that you could count on, you no longer can count on. And the worst imaginable things that you hope and pray never happen, when they happen, they can rock you and shake you to your core, even things that you've believed in your whole life. Some of the most difficult, heartbreaking, painful therapy sessions I've had was dealing with parents with a suicide son or daughter. And some of you may be here today because of that. All right. If a person has the following symptoms for more than 6 months after the loss, they may be suffering from complicated grief. Strong feelings of yearning or longing for the person who died, feeling intensely lonely even when others are around, strong feelings of anger or bitterness related to the death. So these are symptoms of complicated grief. Now, we used to say after 6 months of grieving, that should be sufficient and you should be able to move on. It's time to move on. People will tell you that. It's time to move on. Definitely after 1 year of that loss of a loved one, you should definitely move on then. And so, and it's uncomfortable if you talk too much maybe, or don't talk at all about the lost one and about your grief. It becomes uncomfortable. And so others will be thinking or wanting you to move on. There is no time limit for your grieving. You're going to be grieving when you lose somebody that you've loved. You're going to be grieving for your life long. It's a grief that continues. Now, what usually happens without becoming a complicated grief is your acute, sharp pain, emotional pain, becomes duller over time and becomes a little bit more doable to think about them and to go to the places that you went to before rather than avoid them, because it's going to bring up too much pain. We have a cabin up north, and for several years, my mother, after my dad died, couldn't go to the cabin. It brought up too many memories, and it was too painful for her. But eventually, she was able to start going again. So the symptoms, again, feeling intensely lonely, feeling strong feelings of anger or bitterness. Also feeling like life is empty or meaningless without the person who died. Thinking so much about the person who died that it interferes with doing things or with relationships. Strong feelings of disbelief about the death or finding it very difficult to accept the death. Feeling shocked, dazed, or emotionally numb. Finding it hard to care about or trust other people. More symptoms. Feeling very emotionally or physically activated when confronted with reminders of the loss. Avoiding people, places, or reminders of things that are reminders of the loss. Strong urges to see, touch, hear, or smell things to feel close to the person who died. And again, that comes from the Center for Complicated Grief from Columbia University. So what are some increased risk factors for complicated grief? First of all, pre-existing mental health symptoms, especially depression. Emotionally dependent relationship on the deceased. If there are too many things that you've needed that person for, and now that they're gone, you find yourself having to learn maybe for the first time how to do certain things, the finances perhaps, things around the house, and it becomes a real strong add-on to your grief because you're having to learn things that you never thought you would have to learn, right? Because you were counting on or relying on and dependent upon perhaps that spouse for help with that. Another increased risk factor is just alcohol and drug addiction. So 4 kinds of complicated grief reactions. Different ways that we can demonstrate our complicated grief. One is just a chronic grief reaction that is prolonged or excessive in duration without coming to a satisfactory conclusion. One of the tasks of grieving has not been resolved. So it just means there's still work to do, and we're not able to do that work of accomplishing those tasks. And so it becomes prolonged. Secondly, delayed grief reactions. These are often called inhibited, suppressed, or postponed. There may be an emotional response at the time of the loss, but not sufficient to the loss. And later, with another loss, emotions may be more intense. And so there may be losses that you experience, and you might be surprised that you're not really feeling that much. And it can be a surprise to you because that person may have been really, really important and special to you. But not everyone is aware of or in touch of their emotions. And so it may take a while. It may be difficult to allow yourself to feel what you're really feeling and even become emotionally honest, right? It's oftentimes harder for men to be aware of and allow themselves to feel, especially difficult feelings like helplessness and powerlessness and just plain hurt. We just haven't been socialized that way. We have been socialized to do the opposite, actually. And we grew up in a world where you're not supposed to really feel, and you can't really show a lot of different emotions. And so when it comes to losses and grieving, then that becomes a really big hurdle to get through, to get over. It's just becoming emotionally honest, basically. Another kind of complicated grief reaction is an exaggerated grief reaction. Sometimes the anxiety of losing someone turns into a phobia, actually. The term is called thanatophobia. It's the morbid, abnormal, or persistent fear of one's own death or the process of dying. Masked grief reactions is another kind of complicated grief. Sometimes it just becomes hidden, or we mask it. We can hide it purposefully, intentionally, or unintentionally. Masked or repressed grief generally turns up in one of two ways. Either it's masked as a physical symptom or through some type of aberrant or a maladaptive behavior. So, for instance, if you're used to maybe some social drinking, you might find yourself drinking a lot more often and a lot more drinks at one time. And it may not be, you may not be used to that. It may be abnormal for you, and you may not know exactly why you're doing that. But it can be just a masked grief reaction. A lot of physical somatic symptoms show up from grief. And so again, you may not be feeling directly the sense of loss and emotional pain from grief, but you may be having headaches, stomach problems, chronic fatigue syndrome, a lot of physical illness and ailments come from the stress of grief that adds up over time. And we're simply just not allowing ourselves the time or giving ourselves permission to feel the pain that we feel. Just as a side, just as a FYI, we live in a world or a society that does not grieve really well at all. It's really not that interested in grieving. Much more interested in immediate satisfaction and something to solve the problem right now, right here. And so, which is one reason why opioid dependency has become rampant. I just heard a recent statistic that since last March, since the COVID really has hit us hard for this past year, those opioid overdoses have gone up 26%. Depression, death by opioids have gone up 26%. Depression and anxiety have increased 30 to 40% across the board. We know that suicides have gone up. We just don't have all the statistics about that yet. We will as time goes on eventually. So sometimes when people go to the doctor because of a physical ailment and a somatic concern, the doctor may recognize that there are psychological distresses going on at the same time and may in fact refer to see a therapist or a psychologist just to get some talk therapy and talk through what's been going on recently or some of the losses. Okay, the next session is a neurological basis for grieving. This is kind of an interesting finding. Some researchers, O'Connor and colleagues, found that the intense yearning of complicated grievers brings them as much pleasure and reward as it does pain, which really sounds kind of strange. In both simple and complicated grief, the center of the brain responsible for emotions and memories, the limbic system, is activated. But additionally, the MRI scans of complicated grievers show activation in the brain center responsible for pleasure and rewards and addiction. And that comes from the nucleus accumbens. So pain and pleasure can be really closely tied together. The next slide goes on to say, complicated grievers keep the mourning process alive through their habits. So they may create shrines of their loved ones, constantly looking at their pictures or talking about them constantly. It can seem as if the complicated griever is addicted to the memories of the deceased. Their feelings emphasize more of a wish to keep the person alive rather than an acceptance that the person is gone. So when this happens, there's things happening in the brain, both these centers that are being activated, that bring some degree of pleasure in this feeling of being stuck in the pain. Okay, now we want to move on to cumulative grief. These are just losses which we experience, both concrete and abstract, which add up over time and they accumulate. The less we grieve these losses, the more they add up. So the task that life presents us is this. We need to identify those losses as best as we can, maintain emotional honesty, allowing ourselves to feel those losses. Again, you cannot heal what you do not feel, and allow ourselves times of sadness to grieve these losses appropriately. And that's something, again, that we just don't do well, and our society doesn't really seem too interested in doing as well. Sometimes we're a little bit hesitant and fearful that if we allow ourselves to grieve, we will get sucked down into this Pandora's box or rabbit hole that doesn't have an end. We're afraid of that. But it's not like a hole. Grieving is more like a tunnel. And so the farther you go into the tunnel, the closer you are to coming out the other side. And in the middle of the tunnel is where it's the darkest. And so as you grieve and it becomes darker and darker and darker, the feeling can be, well, this isn't going to end. Why am I doing this, right? Why should I do this? It's just getting harder and worse. But again, when you keep on going, it's going to get lighter and lighter and lighter and better and better and better. We just do not grieve well. We've learned from studies from post-traumatic stress from those who came back from the war that the ones who had the most amount of PTSD were ones that experienced losses growing up early on. And those losses added up to the losses that they also experienced traumatic memories from war. And those are the ones, who have struggled the most. Because again, we don't have a real good understanding of how grief works. We don't like doing it. It's uncomfortable, it's painful. We don't like it. We're used to getting something solved. When we feel any pain, we want to solve it right away. Grieving is not like that. There's no immediate solving and no easy solution. One of the problems with accumulative grief is the abstract losses. And so it's a lot easier to understand the concrete losses that you can remember and you can think about. When I was in school, grade school, probably 5th or 6th grade, we were called out of school, all of my brothers and sisters. I come from a large family of 10. We were called out of school and we didn't know why. It was just it never happened before. And our 4-month-old daughter and sister died. She was born mongoloid, and at 4 months of age, she passed away. That was the first loss that most of us experienced. And it was just natural to grieve and to cry. Most kids will grieve easier and more naturally than adults because they have more freedom and more permission to feel what they feel. It's very, very natural. As I got older, at our cabin, my younger cousin was in a tree fort with 4 or 5 other sisters and cousins. And some of the boys were shooting .22s at birds. It was back in the day when we didn't have much instruction or training, and so way too much freedom, and a .22 bullet hit her straight in the heart, and she died instantly. And again, we experienced grief and loss. That was the second time I remember grieving. We cried with my cousins. Naturally, we grieved strongly, very naturally. And what I didn't understand at the time is that's the best thing you can do, and that's the best way to get through it. We supported each other, we cared for each other, and we grieved our way through that loss. So the abstract losses are more difficult. And so some of these losses may include, thank you, relational hurts from those closest to us. You might not think much of that, but they add up, and more than you think. I see a lot of patients that are actually quite sensitive, some very sensitive, which just means that a sensitive person feels more and they feel more frequently. But the truth is, all of us are a lot more sensitive than we might want to think, or that we might want others to think. It's just our nature. That's who we are as human beings. We're far more vulnerable than we want to admit and think about, because it's scary, basically. So relational hurts add up: relational distance, tension, conflict versus comfort, security and closeness, loss of a sense of importance in careers or relationships. I'm getting to the point in my career where it's dawned upon me that if I'm not there, Nysterman Associates, our clinic, will probably keep going without me, right? And so as we get older, we realize that others can also do our job, and we can feel less needed and less important because of that. Loss of a sense of usefulness in retirement, relationships, or work. Loss of even just physical abilities. There's things that I used to do that I knew when it was the last time that was going to happen. The third time I sprained my ankle, I knew was the last time I would play basketball in a scrimmage or running fast back and forth. I knew it. When I hurt my shoulder and sprained two muscles after a bad wipeout, I knew that was the last time I was water skiing. Okay, that's it. No more. That's not going to happen anymore. Which was a smart thing to do, but it's still a sense of loss. So loss of physical health and well-being, resulting in activities no longer enjoyed. Loss of emotional connectedness as relationships change over time or people drift apart. People change. Relationships change. People that you've known for years, you may not know and be close to as you once were. That's a loss. Loss of physical and emotional safety with an ever-increasing awareness of evil in this world. Probably not anything like this last year to prove that point. The amount of distress and tension and unsettled feeling in the world around us is very, very close as we watched Minneapolis burn and racial tensions, etc. That's a sense of loss. A feeling of safety that you once had has changed. And now you are left more uncertain, maybe than any other time, just what the future is going to be like. Loss of control in relationships with kids, spouses, and work environment. Most of us want to have a good amount of control. Control has become sort of a bad word because people can be over-controlling, or we call them control freaks, right? You're trying to control everything, everyone around you. That's bad. Stop trying to control and, stay in your lane, we might say. Worry about yourself. The truth is, though, that the hardest thing to control is what's on the inside of us. And the anxiety and the worries and the uncertainties that we deal with on a daily basis and the thoughts in our minds, that's what's hard to manage and control and keep some sense of order in. And so instead of that, we try to control the outside and relationships or external things, because if we can control that, then I feel more settled, more secure, etc. But it's too indirect and there's too much and you can't do it. It just doesn't work. So eventually, you really, if you want that to be effective or helpful, you really have to work on what's inside. So why do people fail to grieve? Some relational factors. Ambivalence hinders grief because of excessive amounts of anger and guilt. Highly dependent relationships, again, are also difficult to grieve. There are circumstantial factors when the loss is uncertain, maybe like soldiers missing in action. You don't have a sense of closure, you're not sure what happened. Missing persons, etc., can be very difficult and result in a complicated and accumulative grief. When there's no confirmation of death, etc. Multiple losses like earthquakes, fires, airplane crashes, accidents that maybe kill many members in one family. The feeling of being overwhelmed makes grieving extremely difficult. And a lot of people can feel overwhelmed pretty quickly, pretty easily. That makes grieving harder and perhaps prolonged or protracted as well. Historical factors. Those who've had complicated grief reactions in the past have a higher probability of having another complicated grief reaction. Those with a history of depressive illness run a higher risk of developing complicated grief. Early parental loss may also play a role in developing complicated grief. There's some personality factors. Those individuals whose major defenses are built around avoidance of feelings of helplessness may be among those who have dysfunctional reactions to grief. If part of a person's self-concept includes being the strong one in the family, he or she plays that role to their detriment when it comes to grieving. You really don't want to be known as the strong one. Much better to be aware of and in tune with how you're really feeling and honest with how you're feeling. It's okay, you've got to carry on. You have to do what you have to do, but you need times where you're allowing yourself to feel sad. Again, another fear of grieving, besides the rabbit hole, is that if I start grieving, I'm not just going to feel sad, but I'm going to feel depressed. I'm going to go into a depression. The difference between sadness and depression is basically hope. So when you grieve, you need to maintain and instill hope. Keep your hope strong and alive. Depression is simply sadness without hope. And it makes it, it's a whole different level. There are some social factors when the loss is socially unspeakable, which is often the case of a suicidal death. This becomes especially difficult when the circumstances are ambiguous and nobody knows if it was an accident or a suicide. Also, when the loss is socially negated, which may be the case with abortion, which is too often done in social isolation. Why people fail to grieve? The absence of social support network. This may be due to geography, moving away from family and friends, or just from social isolation. Certainly, we've all been socially isolated in the past year, way more than we ever should have been. But we need to be safe at the same time. There's a study of London widows that found that those who were the most angry following the loss of their husbands also experienced the highest degree of social isolation. So be careful not to allow your anger to push away your support network. It's okay to feel angry, but don't allow that anger to take prominence and to keep you from the support that you need. Okay, I mentioned the tasks of grieving. The first task is, again, and the biggest one, is acceptance of the reality of the loss. The one that is the hardest is the second one, working through the pain of the grief. It's just painful. We're not into pain. We don't like feeling physical pain for sure, but emotional pain feels even worse. So we really don't want to feel that. As you grieve, you will recognize that you can feel that pain and be okay. In fact, the more you grieve, the more you begin to feel and recognize the sense of substance in you, a strength that you may not have known before. And you won't know it unless you allow yourself to feel that. Thirdly, adjusting to the environment in which the loved one is missing. That's a task of grieving. We have to make those adjustments. Those are very often practical and very concrete ones, but they're important because that's kind of where you live day to day. And lastly, to emotionally relocate the deceased and move on with life. And that may sound kind of abstract and ambiguous, but again, it just means to come to grips with the loss and be able to do the things that you need to do for yourself to be able to move on and make your life a life worth living after the loss. Just some scriptures pertaining to grief and mourning. We have really good, strong encouragement in the scriptures to allow ourselves to grieve and to go through the grieving. Certainly, Christ was very much the strongest example as a griever and acquainted with grief and went through his own pain in the Garden of Gethsemane as well as Calvary. So Psalm 30, verse 5, weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. Joy comes out of grieving and weeping. Psalm 34, the Lord is near the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Psalm 126, 5, they who sow in tears shall reap in joy and singing. And Matthew 5, verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So my hope and my prayer for you is that in your grieving, you will experience the comfort that comes from the Holy Spirit. He is the great comforter. And you will also know what it feels like to have the presence of Christ with you as you grieve. And that makes all the difference in the world. All right, is there any questions? Do we have time for questions? Are there any questions, comments? Yes. Yes, it does. The comment was somebody had told him that the greater the love, the greater the grief. Yes, and that's exactly what David Kessler would say. He is a grief therapist and writer and speaker around the world, actually. His website, again, is grief.com. But yes, grieving comes from emotional attachments for having loved. The stronger the attachments, the stronger the grief. Some people don't understand why people grieve when they lose their pet, animal, their dog, their cat, etc. Well, there's some strong emotional attachments to pets. Absolutely. So there's definitely real, genuine grieving when it comes to that. Yes. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thanks again, Jack, for being with us. Next week, our program will be Where is God in Our Suffering? And Pastor Lisa Richardson will be our speaker. She will also lead our service of hope and healing. What we'll do next week is you will still come to this room and I will do an opening for you. Sorry. We will start in this room. I will open it and then we'll be dismissed to groups. The groups tonight will be the groups next week as well. So pay attention to where you end up. And then you'll come back for the talk and the service. For next fall, our series will be at St. Philip's Lutheran Church in Fridley, beginning September 13. If you registered, you should be getting a brochure in the mail later in the summer when they come out, okay? And also, it will be on our website for Growing Through Loss. What else? I'll announce the groups. I think that's the only thing. If people have questions, I will stay around. Tonight, there are going to be 5 loss of spouse groups. There are some people who are here for the first time tonight. Please come and see me so that I can get you to the right group. The other groups are established now, so we want to have the new people be in the new group. These are all loss of spouse groups. Jill Peterson will be in the room across from the boiler room. Phyllis Anderson in Fellowship Hall. Dwayne Nelson in Fellowship Hall. John Dahl across from the restrooms. And Jack Anderson will be across from the restrooms, the other end of the room. It's a big room, so John's group will be on one end and Jack's will be on the other. Loss of child, Nancy Matheson, the choir room. Loss of parent, Tom Schlor in the coffee house. Loss of sibling or friend with Sue Thompson in the chapel. Transitional loss with Charlotte Drone and Darlene Forgy in the library. And suicide survivors with Michelle Gustafson in the youth room. And if there's any question as to where those rooms are, I will be able to help you find those rooms. So we'll see you next week. Good night.